So in the last video, we saw that China was weakening. The Qing dynasty was weakening. They lost the Opium War. Then they had to deal with the Taiping. And now they have the rise of the warlords acting as independent governments essentially within China. So there were those within the government who realized that China needed to change. One idea was self-strengthening. This concept of where you could adopt Western technology, everything from the steam engine to modern rifles, while keeping traditional Confucian and Chinese values. The problem is just adopting technology does not solve any of the other problems like government incompetence or corruption. It's basically putting a fresh coat of paint on the house without fixing the foundation. It's not going to be enough, right? It's not just about China's behind technology. It was about true problems within the government itself that need to be addressed that aren't going to be addressed. So it doesn't really work. The imperialists just gain more and more power. Eventually, the imperialist has spheres of influences, areas of exclusive trade rights, which they buy from the warlords. You know, the warlords arose during the Taiping, and after the Taiping, they remained in power in their various areas, and they would sell the spheres of influences to these foreign countries. So you had certain zones in China where only Britain traded. You had certain zones for the French and the Japanese and the Russians, and you would pay the warlords for those exclusive trade rights. And so China, represented by that man there, is being divided up by the British, by the Germans, by the Russians, by the French, by the Japanese. Right? They're carving China up in the spheres of influences. Then China goes to war with Japan over territory, and China actually loses. It's very embarrassing for China. China always viewed itself as Japan's superior. For centuries, it was Japan's superior. Now Japan has won. It's another blow to the Chinese ego and spirit, basically. Very embarrassing. Finally, China gets an emperor who really wants to reform, and the young emperor Guangzhou. Guangzhou wants to truly reform, not just self-strengthening, where you just kind of apply this band-aid and use Western tech. He really wanted to overhaul everything. He wanted to introduce a Western-style educational system. He wanted to replace the civil service exam for government jobs with something more modern, had not really been changed in over 1,000 years. He wanted to modernize and restructure the government. He wanted to modernize the military. He wanted to introduce modern banking as well. He wanted to introduce free press. So there's a wide series of reforms, and altogether we call this the 100 Days of Reform. The fact that it has a name, 100 Days, is probably not a good sign because not everyone within the government and military like this. Some of them feel threatened. Some feel like he's abandoning traditional Chinese values. So there are conservative officials within the government and the military who don't like these reforms. There's also a conservative member of his family, Empress Dowager Cixi. Empress Dowager Cixi had been running China for decades at this point. In fact, she ran China while Guangzhou was growing up until he was old enough to truly become emperor and take the power. She does not like all that he is doing, and with the support of conservative military and government officials, she actually overthrows Guangzhou and puts him in prison and stops the 100 days of reform, ends all the reforms, so nothing really changes in China, which was not good because you can see in this political cartoon, China is the dragon, and the other countries like Britain and Russia and America and France and Germany and Japan, they are carving it up. In fact, there was growing tension among all those foreigners because the idea was, well, the Qing dynasty is about to collapse, and when it collapses, we all want a piece of China. So to avoid this hysteria, the U.S. Secretary of State proposes the open door policy. Make China like an open door. Give everyone equal trade access to China. No more spheres of influences. Now, the other countries do not go for this concept of equal access, but they do realize, hey, there's enough China to go around, right? And the hysteria dies down. Unfortunately, another incident happens that's going to be a further sign of weakness. The Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers were members of this organization called this Society of the Harmonious Fist. Foreigners called them Boxers because they would shadow box as part of their training. And the Boxers hated foreigners and Christian missionaries. Because Christian missionaries were associated with imperialism. So, and they wanted to drive out all foreigners from China, and that included the Qing, because the Qing technically are not Chinese; they are Manchu. So that applied to Empress Dowager Shiji. So the Boxers begin to kill foreigners, murder foreigners. Shiji is worried about this because technically she's a foreigner, because technically she's of Manchu heritage. And so what she does is she hijacks the rebellion and endorses it and tells them, hey, drive out all the Westerners. This does not work. Instead, what happens is Britain, France, Germany, Russia, US, and Japan all send soldiers into China and crush the Boxer Rebellion, then blame Shiji for the rebellion because she supported the rebellion and made China pay indemnity, or pay for damages. And so it's just one disaster after another. You go from the Opium War to the Taiping to the rise of the warlords to self strengthening not working to losing a war with Japan to the 100 Days of Reform, but then they were stopped by Shiji, to the Boxer Rebellion, to all these countries on the screen invading and sending in soldiers to stop the Boxer Rebellion, to China having to pay indemnity or damages for the Boxer Rebellion. So it was one mess up and one tragedy after another.